Hello everybody and welcome back to this video. In today's video we are going to be testing out the metallics and some of the effects ranges from the new FANATIC war paints from the army painter, which they sent me out early, and I'm going to be putting them through their paces. I often think with these videos, context is really important, and actually putting them through their paces on models rather than say on bases or something like that is probably going to be a little bit more useful for you guys. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a gamut of metallics that they sent over to paint the torso of this Knight Atropos. Maybe one day I will finish this Knight Atropos, but basically I want to talk through how to do this Knight, the effects that I've used, and then give you my thoughts as we go through the video as well. So first off, we're going to be using glittering green. Now this is kind of similar to one of their paints they used before. One thing I would say though is that when you get these paints out, when you put them into a wet palette, whatever, one thing I found with the previous war paints was that you could see the flecks, the metallic flecks within the paint. They would separate so you could actually see them. That you can't see the individual flecks within these paints now. Which I think is a vast improvement on their previous range. And these were top notch, and I was amazed actually how well they went through the airbrush despite the fact that they weren't airbrush paints. I thinned it with probably kind of 2 parts thinner to 1 part paint, but for you guys, for your individual airbrushes and compressors, it will be different, and just getting your head around exactly what ratio of thinner to thinnest paint you'll need with the new Fanatics range will be kind of up to you, but yeah, I think as a rule of thumb 2 parts thinner to 1 part paint. In terms of the Knight, the hull, the shell, I gave it 2 thin coats of glittering green, and it went down really nicely. If you use a black undercoat, it will appear darker. I've gone for something, I've gone for a grey, so I'm just going for something slightly lighter, and you can see here I'm using washes through the airbrush. This is the second time I've done this. Now what I want to do, because there's no contrast on this metallic shell at the moment, what I want to do is artificially create some contrast, because I hear that's a really cool thing to do in model making and model painting, and I'm using the color wheel. So basically I've got a green kind of metallic, and what I'm doing is I'm shading it with red to maximize contrast, so it will appear darker, but also color wheel, color theory, all that kind of jazz. But the one thing I would say about the new washes is that they're great as washes, but they're not like an ink. They don't pack a punch straight through the airbrush. You need to build them up in several layers, which is absolutely fine. They're just several thin layers. If you want something that packs more of a punch and you just want to do it in one layer, then I'd suggest something like a speed paint, blood red through the airbrush would be absolutely great. But actually this gives a really kind of quite subtle variation to the metallics, which I really liked. But you can see me in between layers just using the hairdryer just to make sure everything's dry, and you can see I probably used about 3 to 4 thin coats of the red and built it up, build it up. But one thing I would say is that looking at the final model, I mean, it looks quite cool, even if I do say so myself, but I would recommend probably using more layers of red, or indeed this blue. So what I wanted to do was further reinforce the highlights, and just at the very bottom of the kind of the shading that I'm trying to create here, I've just used blue, so overlapping the red and the blue, which gives really nice contrast on the shell. But as I say, I'd probably reinforce this a bit more had I known kind of what I know now. That's not a criticism of the war paints. That's more me getting used to them and feeling confident with them, and knowing how far to push this kind of shading. So we're going to use gunmetal. So it's a nice kind of, it is not a super dark metal, this one. I'd call it kind of a mid-range, but they do have darker metals kind of on offer, but this is kind of a mid-range metal to a darker metal, somewhere in between there. But I think most of you will probably use this as your kind of like base layer metal. Exactly the same experience with glittering green. which was that it just went through the airbrush really, really nicely. And it kind of, 2 thin coats was enough to do this entire black undercoated kind of skeleton of the model. But again, I was really impressed considering it's not an air paint. It went through the airbrush really, really well. So let's have a look at the washes in action. So I've used some of the washes through the airbrush already, but I don't think you guys have seen me actually use the washes actually on the model yet. And they behave how their previous washes behave. Now, one of the things I would say about their previous range of washes was that if it pulled too heavily in certain areas, it was quite shiny, and could also be a little bit plasticky, I found. And I was conscious, and I thought this would be a really good test to see if that happened, because you always have on skeletons like these kind of pooling in certain areas. I didn't find it at all. I don't think it dulled the metallics too much, but as a wash, obviously it's going to dull the metallics slightly, but we're going to bring that back a little bit later with some kind of dry brushing with some mithril a little bit later. And then we're going to do some battle damage on our torso. Now, you could use a brown colour for this, or you can use a silver. I think because it was a metallic shell, I'd recommend a silver. Now, I have done transfers on this model. This isn't actually kind of a video exploring kind of transfers and kind of doing the oil streaking and things like that. If you want to have a look more at that, then I've got loads of videos on offer for you guys to have a look at how exactly I would do transfers and how I do oil streaking and things like that. But as I say, I've just used kind of just a little bit of silver chipping here and there. You can create scratches as you want to. I've just used a sponge just to kind of create indentations and marks within this glittering green shell. But I think the other good thing, because it's not a clear paint, this, you could actually over the transfers use the glittering green paint on top of the white transfer to show kind of that chipping of that transfer as well. So that's the benefit of using a metallic paint like this rather than something like a clear paint, because you wouldn't be able to create that kind of same effect. Again, though, if you want to know more about kind of like battle damage and oil streaking, how to do transfers, how to weather them kind of appropriately in keeping with the rest of the model, I've got loads of videos all about that you guys should check out. The other benefit of this is that you're kind of just catching the edges, if there are any edges on the model, with this kind of sponge chipping, because we can't really kind of edge highlight this model because of the fact it's a metallic paint. So doing this kind of does a little bit of edge highlighting for us. And then we're going to use satin varnish on the green. So I would really recommend, if you're using metallic paints in this way, that you don't matte them down, because it will really knock back the effects of the metallics. Of course, if you like that effect, that's absolutely fine. You can do that. This is Army Painter's satin varnish, but it also, you know, it maintains the luster of the metallics, which is what I want. I kind of want a battle damage, grimy, streaked kind of look, but I still want you to be able to tell that it was kind of a metallic, it has a metallic sheen at once upon a time. So over to the gold. So rough iron is going to be a paint that I think that most people will just end up using for coppers, for golds, great base color. I would describe this as the old Games Workshop kind of warp lock bronze. I think that's the old one that they used to have, which was a color that I absolutely loved. But I found the Games Workshop one, whatever the equivalent was, even if they still have that paint, quite claggy. I didn't find any clagginess with any of these paints at all. And by clagginess, I mean the moment, you know, it goes on a dry palette, it will start to dry and just very, very hard to work with. I didn't find that at all. Obviously, these paints dry over time, of course, but the working time on them was actually quite reasonable. I thought I was able to come back even on a dry palette and still use them kind of 10-15 minutes afterwards without any kind of clagginess to them. So we are using a mix here of rough iron, let's have a look, and greedy gold. So I think this was a mix of 3-1 in favour of the greedy gold, and I'm just base coating the metallics here. I would say though, and because it's not going over a matte finished kind of model, and because the model we've used glittering green, I think it's inevitable that you were going to have to use 2 thin coats of this paint, just because of what is lying underneath it, which doesn't astound me, and it doesn't, nor does it disappoint me. I think it's just, you just have to accept that because of the way that we're building up these metallics and because of what they're going over, 2 thin coats perfectly reasonable. That would be the same for any kind of metallic paint going over other metallic paints as well. But I found for darker models and smaller areas, when I've used them on the Space Marine models that I've done a video on, 1 coat was absolutely fine of the silvers going over a matte kind of a matte finish. What you can see me doing here is just giving some rough highlights using greedy gold, and I'm following the highlight that I've created. So the bottom is that the bottom of those panels I'm going to keep with that kind of darkish gold color, that rough iron color, and then kind of 2/3 of the way upwards I'm then using greedy gold. But you can see I'm being quite rough with this, and then I will smooth out the blends a little bit later with the washes. But you could just gradually add more and more greedy gold to the original mix that we've created to make quite nice smooth transitions. I didn't find though metallics, you've got a little bit of flexibility with transitions, I always find, especially when you use washes and things like that. But yeah, as I say, we will get nice smooth transitions with our washes a little bit later. But you can already see, actually, like the moment we start kind of working the metallics in, the transitions are quite nice. And then we're going to go to bright gold, which is a super yellow gold. But a natural kind of progression on top of greedy gold. And again, all of these colours, none of them, I couldn't see the flex within the metallics. They were really nice to use. They went down really, really nicely. And I didn't need to use, once I got to this point, I didn't need to use 2 thin coats. It was just on that initial base layer that 2 thin coats were appropriate. And then you can see here at the top of the panels, I guess at the brightest part, I'm just using this bright gold. And then I'm following the transitions that I've created. So what we don't want is metallics not following the transitions that we created on our panels. So it's really important that we keep everything in keeping with one another. And you can see here just on the front hull, which is going to be, the part that the eye is drawn to most, I'm just bringing that kind of highlight in tighter and tighter. So we're just working in, I guess, the last 25%, 20% in that band. And actually you can see the transition between green gold and bright gold is actually quite smooth. Going to use strong tone and purple tone. So strong tone I used earlier on the skeleton. I've added a little bit of purple within this mix because color theory. We've got a yellowish gold, and then I want to be able to contrast that. So just adding a little bit of purple into this kind of dark brownish wash will just maximize the contrast, and it just looks good. Okay, so we just, all throughout this model, we're constantly thinking about color theory, and like some sort of mad kind of scientist, this was like the first time that I'd used these washes in this way. I just mixed them together, and hey presto, it actually worked. And you can see me not absolutely slathering all the gold areas in this wash, this 50-50 wash. I'm just going over the rivets, over particular areas where I think that there would be dust and grime build up, but also where I think the shadows would be as well, particularly on the rivets, because we want to define those with our washes. But we can also use this wash and almost use it as a glaze, so we can go into the shadows repeatedly once it's dry, and then create some kind of further kind of contrast with our golds and in our golds. But the other thing is that doing that, glazing our washes in, also means that I'm able to kind of smooth out the transitions that we were talking about previously between that rough iron and that greedy gold. I'm just going to do some quite simple dry brushing here. I'm just mixing a little bit of mithril silver into the bright gold, and you can kind of see the colour that it creates within the dry palette there. And I'm just doing a little bit of edge highlighting. Now, you could go and edge highlight everything here, but that's not my style of painting really, unless it's a display piece model. you know, I just quite like things to be rough and ready, but also look quite realistic. So there's no need to go around and edge highlight absolutely kind of everything, just the outer edges, just to add definition. But also, this incidentally picks up all the rivets as well. Just dry brushing these areas and just being careful with the dry brush just picks out those incidental, incidentally picks out those rivets. So we have some copper colours here. So we've got true copper, but we've also got rough iron as well. And this is kind of almost a 50-50 mix, true copper, rough iron. Rough iron is a really lovely colour, but it's super, super dark for what we're about to do. So rough iron mixed with true copper. This I thought, this was when I got to this point, I was like, whoa, these paints are really nice. So much so, I think that the coppers that I might use day to day, I would just replace them with these now, I think. Because you'll see at the end how nice that they look. And then with the Verdigris on, they look super tasty. And then for this bit, we can just keep the highlight quite rough. Because of the Verdigris that we're going to use in a little bit, the transitions here don't need to be as smooth as we made them with the gold. I'm not going to use any patina effects on the gold. And you can just see me here just quite roughly stabbing the brush in, slathering the paint on, just getting all the details, but you know, mainly focusing on the middle element. So kind of just thinking about the lights and the shades and contrast. However, you can be quite rough here because of the next steps coming up. And I would also say that there's no reason, if you're about to smother this thing in patina or Verdigris and use some effect paints, there's no reason to wash it. Your washes will just be completely lost. So there's no reason at all. So we're going to use two paints here. So I'm going to use Ferrogard, which is one of the WARPAINTS FANATIC, kind of just their acrylic set. But I'm also going to use Verdigris effects as well. And the reason I'm doing this is because I like to build up patina. You know, patina isn't all the same. There will be different degrees of patina, different degrees of Verdigris. There'll be some lighter parts, some darker parts. Now, you could argue that I could have some kind of... I could use an even darker colour to this. But I'm okay with it, and I think it came out really nicely. Now, this Ferrogard is just mixed with water. Nothing special. You know, no glaze medium, nothing like that. Just mixed with water. And then you can see me just wiping away with a finger where I've been a bit too slapdash, just wiping away kind of areas where I feel like the patina wouldn't build up. You can see me with the cotton wool bud there, just picking it out. But this is our kind of our base layer. Now this will dry much darker than what it looks like now. And you can see here, this is our first layer. And then we've got our Verdigris effects paint. And what I'm going to do is just build this up. And this is, again, just mixed with water. I'm just going to build this up in areas that I think would kind of collect the most amount of patina, you know, where the oxidation would essentially happen, where water would kind of go into all the nooks and crannies. But I wouldn't use it everywhere, and I wouldn't stop it all over, unless that's the kind of like look that you are going for. So just be a little bit careful. It packs a punch, I would say, this Verdigris paint. So be a little bit careful. With it. The skeleton. So this is all dried. I left it overnight because I just kind of did it before I went to bed. But you could speed things up with a hairdryer. And then this is just a dry brush of mithril silver. Nothing too complex. I'm just using a makeup brush just to pick out all the kind of the details, bring a little bit of life back to the skeleton once we've kind of dulled it down with that with the washes that we've used. But the thing I would say when dry brushing this, and it's good that you guys see this, is that the paints aren't chalky. And one of the things I absolutely hate with some paints, especially when you're dry brushing them, is that they can be quite chalky. You know, you see lots of people talk about, oh, well, it's the way that you use the dry brush and how you're dry brushing. Sometimes it's literally just the paint. And I didn't find that these were too chalky at all. And I'm going to use some rust effects here. Love things to be a little bit grim and grimy and dark. And I'm just putting this and literally just sloshing it all over our metal kind of skeleton. I really wanted to show off some of these effects to you guys and see what they're kind of capable of doing. Now, this might look like to you, oh my days, like he's used so much kind of rust effects here. This will all be knocked back. It dries a lot darker when mixed with water than it looks like right now. So that's something to bear in mind. And if you want a stronger rust effect, I would build it up in several layers, or I would use one of the FANATIC acrylic paints that's a slightly lighter tint of what I'm using here. And you can see how subtle it is. This is all dried now. And you can see the rust in the crevices, and it looks nice and subtle. I really like the effect here, but some of you might go, oh, I want it to be more rusty. And then finally, we're going to use some blood effects. I know this is a little bit unusual, but as this is a kind of like a speedy job and I wanted to kind of show off what the effects and the metallics are capable of, I'm using the blood effects over mithril silver to do the lens. And this is great because the blood effects, they're essentially, they dry glossy. You know, they're fresh blood effects. They've got a dry blood effects, but this is the fresh one. But because they dry glossy, it gives the effect of a lens, which is really, really nice. And this is just going over mithril silver, so it will be as bright as it possibly can be. And then kind of all the areas that have lens, I would just use this. You could always use a dot of white if you wanted, or you could give it a coat of gloss varnish just with a brush. But actually, it was glossy enough for me to make it look like a realistic lens, and I was happy with it. Especially at this scale, I think that sometimes, you know, using kind of lens effects like this where they're glossy, they look quite cool, and I think they look perhaps more realistic than, you know, the typical way that you might see GW create a lens. But that's just me. It will be completely up to you how you do it. So hopefully that has given you guys kind of a real taster of what these metallic paints are capable of doing. None of the techniques, as I always say, none of the techniques that I've used require a lot of skill. Loads of them, these techniques, are just procedural, you know, and you've now got the procedure having seen what I've done with them. You know, dry brushing, a little bit of airbrushing, you know, layering, nothing too complicated here at all. But the paints, I thought, performed excellently. Out of all the things I've used so far, you know, when I've been using these paints, the metallics are the ones that I'm really, really excited about. So much so that I'm definitely going to, at some point, finish this Night Atropos off, because I think it will look wicked. Guys, I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope this has been useful for you. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment as well. I'd really appreciate it if you give me a subscribe, and I shall see you on the next one.